Heir to the shadows. Francesca Benedetti had always been careful. She never let herself want the things she could not have. But when she kissed the wrong man, when she let him press her against a marble wall, his hands rough, his mouth claiming she knew she had made the kind of mistake that could start a war. Because he was Lorenzo Santoro, the enemy's heir. And now, when she walked into the family estate for a meeting she was never meant to attend, she felt his gaze settle on her like a brand. "You should have stayed away," he murmured, stepping closer. "Now it's too late." Chapter 1. The Kiss That Ignited Flames. The air in the dimly lit corridor had been thick with the scent of old money and older secrets, a familiar perfume to Francesca Benedetti, even if this particular corner of the world was one she rarely frequented. The annual gala hosted by the Marchesi family was in full swing, a swirling vortex of silk gowns, tailored suits, and carefully constructed pleasantries that masked the underlying currents of power and rivalry that flowed beneath the surface of their elite society. Francesca had only attended at her mother's insistence, a subtle reminder that even a woman of 58, widowed for over a decade, still had a role to play in the intricate dance of family alliances. Francesca had spent most of the evening circulating, exchanging polite nothings with acquaintances, her smile fixed, her mind elsewhere. She'd been thinking of her small bookstore, nestled in a quiet corner of Florence, a sanctuary filled with the comforting scent of paper and ink, a world far removed from the gilded cage of her family's legacy. The bookstore was hers, a small act of rebellion against the life she'd been born into, a life she'd largely retreated from after her husband, Marco, had died. Seeking a moment of respite from the oppressive opulence, she'd slipped away from the ballroom, drawn down a less traveled hallway adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. It was there, in the shadowed alcove beneath a particularly imposing painting of a long-dead Marchesi patriarch, that she'd encountered him. Lorenzo Santoro. She'd known, of course, who he was. Everyone in their world did. The Santoro family, the Benedetti's most formidable rivals, their feud stretching back generations, a tangled web of bloodshed and broken treaties. Lorenzo, the heir apparent, the future Don, was a figure shrouded in whispers and speculation. Dangerous, ruthless, untouchable, and, undeniably, captivating. He'd been leaning against the wall, a glass of amber liquid swirling in his hand, his dark eyes fixed on something unseen in the distance. He hadn't noticed her at first, and Francesca had almost turned back, unwilling to intrude on whatever private moment he was having. But then, he'd shifted, his gaze sweeping across the hallway, and their eyes had met. It wasn't just the surprise of seeing him there, outside the carefully orchestrated confines of the gala, that had made her breath catch in her throat. It was the intensity of his stare, the way it seemed to strip away the layers of polite pretense, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable. He was even more striking up close than the rumors suggested. Tall, with the lean, powerful build of a man accustomed to command, his dark hair was swept back from a forehead that bore a faint, almost imperceptible scar, a whisper of a past she knew nothing about. His eyes, a deep, unsettling brown, held a mixture of darkness and something else, a flicker of something that looked almost like loneliness. He'd straightened, his gaze never leaving hers, and a slow, almost predatory smile had curved his lips. "Francesca Benedetti," he'd murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. An unexpected pleasure. She'd forced a polite smile, her heart hammering against her ribs. Senior Santoro. The formality felt absurd, given the circumstances, given the way his eyes were still locked on hers, a silent challenge in their depths. "Lorenzo," he corrected, taking a step closer. "We're hardly strangers, are we?" She'd known she should have turned and walked away. She should have retreated back to the safety of the crowded ballroom, to the familiar world of polite smiles and empty conversations. But some reckless impulse she hadn't felt in years, had kept her rooted to the spot. He'd moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, closing the distance between them until he was standing just inches away, his presence overwhelming, the scent of his cologne something dark and musky, with a hint of citrus filling her senses. "You're not where you belong, are you?" he'd asked, his voice barely a whisper now, his eyes searching hers. She'd swallowed, trying to ignore the sudden dryness in her throat. "I needed some air." He'd chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "The air in here is stifling." But perhaps not as stifling as it could be. And then, before she could fully process his words, before she could even think of protesting, he'd reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure, unexpected sensation that sent her senses reeling. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "You know, they say curiosity killed the cat, Francesca." She'd looked up at him, her eyes wide, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And satisfaction brought it back. She'd whispered, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. A proverb, a silly saying, but in that moment, it felt like a dare. His smile had widened, a flash of white teeth against the darkness of his skin. Brave words, for a Benedetti. And then, he'd kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss, a tentative exploration. It was a claiming, a possessive, almost desperate embrace. He'd pulled her against him, his other hand finding the small of her back, pressing her flesh against the cool marble of the wall. His mouth was rough, demanding, his tongue sweeping against hers, a silent battle of wills that she found herself unexpectedly losing. The world had narrowed, the sounds of the gala fading into a distant hum, the only reality the feel of his body against hers, the taste of him, the scent of his skin, the rough texture of his suit jacket beneath her fingertips. She'd close her eyes, abandoning herself to the moment, to the forbidden thrill of his embrace. It was a kiss that tasted of danger, of forbidden desire, of a world she'd always kept at arm's length. It was a kiss that shattered the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart, leaving her raw and exposed. When he finally pulled away, his breathing ragged, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher, she'd felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in years. Regret? Longing? Fear? All of them, intertwined and impossible to untangle. He traced the line of her lips with his thumb, his gaze lingering on her mouth. That, he'd whispered, his voice hoarse, was a mistake. She'd nodded, her own voice lost somewhere in the chaos of her emotions. A mistake we're both going to pay for, he'd added, his eyes hardening, the warmth replaced by a chilling certainty. He'd stepped back then, the spell broken, the reality of their situation crashing down on her with the force of a physical blow. She was Francesca Benedetti, widow of Marco, a woman who had always played by the rules, a woman who had always known her place. He was Lorenzo Santoro, the heir to a family that had been her family's sworn enemy for generations. And that kiss had changed everything. The carefully constructed truce was over. The battle lines were drawn. She watched his retreating figure until Lorenzo disappeared completely from her sight. The corridor now felt colder, the portraits more menacing. The gala's noise seemed to amplify, buzzing in her head, creating a sense of unease she hadn't previously felt. This was a mistake. A huge mistake. What was she going to do? Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Unveiled. The drive back to the Benedetti estate was a blur of rain-slicked streets and blurred city lights. Francesca sat in the back of the chauffeured car, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but her mind was miles away, replaying the encounter with Lorenzo Santoro over and over again. The feel of his lips on hers, the intensity of his gaze, the chilling certainty in his voice when he'd spoken of the consequences of their actions, it all swirled within her, a tempest of conflicting emotions. Her mother, Isabella, sat beside her, her usual regal composure slightly ruffled. She'd noticed Francesca's distracted state, of course, but had attributed it to the late hour and the general tedium of the Marchesi Gala. Isabella Benedetti was a woman who valued appearances above all else, a woman who had spent her life upholding the traditions and expectations of their family. She would never understand Francesca's reckless impulse, the momentary lapse in judgment that had led to that forbidden kiss. The Marchese heir seemed quite taken with young Emilia Rossi, Isabella remarked, breaking the silence, her voice laced with a subtle hint of disapproval. A suitable match, I suppose, though the Rossi family lacks a certain refinement. Francesca murmured a non-committal response, her mind still racing. She knew her mother was fishing for information, trying to gauge her reaction to the evening's social dynamics. Isabella had always hoped Francesca would remarry, to secure another advantageous alliance for the family. But Francesca had no interest in such arrangements. After Marco's death, she'd found a quiet solace in her independence, a freedom she wasn't willing to relinquish. The car pulled into the long, winding driveway leading up to the Benedetti estate, a sprawling villa perched on a hillside overlooking Florence. The house, a centuries-old testament to the family's enduring power and influence, was a place of both comfort and confinement for Francesca. It was filled with memories, both good and bad, echoes of laughter and tears, of triumphs and tragedies. As they stepped out of the car, the cool night air washed over Francesca, a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the gala. The scent of rain-soaked earth and blooming jasmine filled her lungs, a familiar fragrance that always grounded her. "You seem tired, Cara," Isabella said, her voice softening slightly as they walked towards the grand entrance. "Perhaps a glass of chamomile tea before bed?" Francesca managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Mama, but I think I'll just go straight to my room." She knew she wouldn't be able to sleep, not with her mind in such turmoil, but she needed to be alone, to process the events of the evening, to try to make sense of the chaos that Lorenzo Santoro had unleashed within her. Her room, a spacious suite on the second floor, was a sanctuary of muted colors and soft textures, a haven from the more formal, imposing rooms of the main house. She changed into a silk nightgown, the cool fabric a welcome relief against her skin, and walked over to the large windows that overlooked the gardens below. The rain had stopped, and a sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape. Francesca gazed out at the city, the twinkling lights spread out before her like a vast, shimmering tapestry. It was a beautiful view, one that had always brought her a sense of peace, but tonight, it only served to amplify her unease. She thought of Marco, her late husband. He had been a good man, kind and gentle, a man who had loved her deeply. Their marriage had been arranged, of course, a union of two powerful families, but they had found a genuine affection for each other, a quiet understanding that had transcended the constraints of their arranged union. His death, a sudden heart attack, had left a void in her life, a wound that had never fully healed. And now Lorenzo Santoro, a man who was everything Marco was not, dangerous, unpredictable, a man who embodied the very essence of the world she had tried to escape. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull, the undeniable attraction she felt towards him. It was a dangerous game, a forbidden desire, and she knew, deep down, that it could only lead to heartache. She turned away from the window, her gaze falling on the antique writing desk that sat in the corner of the room. It had belonged to her grandmother, Nonna Emilia, a woman who had been a formidable force in the Benedetti family, a woman who had known both great love and great loss. Francesca walked over to the desk and opened the top drawer, revealing a collection of old letters, photographs, and other mementos. She reached for a faded photograph, her fingers tracing the image of a young woman with laughing eyes and a mischievous smile. It was Nonna Emilia, taken long before Francesca was born, a time when the feud with the Santoro family was at its height. Beneath the photograph, she found a small, leather-bound diary. She'd seen it before, of course, but had never dared to open it, fearing the secrets it might contain. Tonight, however, she felt a strange compulsion to delve into the past, to seek some understanding of the forces that had shaped her family's history, the forces that had led to that fateful kiss. She opened the diary, the brittle pages crackling beneath her fingertips. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, a testament to a bygone era. The first entry was dated over 70 years ago, a time when Nonna Amelia was a young woman, newly married to Francesca's grandfather, Alessandro Benedetti. As Francesca began to read, she was transported to another time, another world. A world of passionate love, bitter rivalries, and unspoken betrayals. A world where the lines between right and wrong were blurred, where loyalty and honor were paramount, and where the consequences of one's actions could reverberate through generations. Nonna Amelia's words painted a vivid picture of the early days of the feud with the Santoro family, a conflict that had begun over a disputed territory, a betrayal of trust, and a love affair that had ended in tragedy. She wrote of her own forbidden attraction to a young Santoro man, a man who had been her family's sworn enemy, a man who had stirred within her a passion she had never known before. Francesca read on, her heart pounding in her chest, the words on the page blurring through a film of tears. She saw parallels between her own situation and Nonna Amelia's, a chilling echo of the past repeating itself in the present. The diary revealed that this attraction blossomed into something more, and a secret affair began. The affair was passionate and intense, but, naturally, short-lived. The diary ended abruptly. No mention of what happened to the young Santoro man.
No closure.
Just blank pages. Francesca closed the diary, her hands trembling. The weight of her family's history, the weight of that forbidden kiss, pressed down on her with renewed force. What had she done? And what would happen next? Chapter 3. A meeting of enemies and longing. The summons arrived the following morning, delivered by a somber-faced man in a dark suit, a man Francesca recognized as one of her uncle, Giovanni's, most trusted lieutenants. It was a simple, handwritten note on heavy cream-colored paper, bearing the Benedetti family crest, a stylized falcon clutching a serpent. The message was brief and to the point. Francesca, your presence is required at a family meeting this afternoon at 3 o'clock sharp. Your uncle Giovanni requests your attendance. Isabella. Francesca's heart sank as she read the note. She knew, instinctively, that this meeting had something to do with her encounter with Lorenzo Santoro. The speed with which the news had traveled was both alarming and predictable. In their world, secrets were a currency, and information flowed through a network of whispers and informants, reaching the ears of those in power with astonishing swiftness. She spent the morning in a state of anxious anticipation, trying to distract herself with tasks around the estate, but her mind kept returning to the impending meeting, to the inevitable confrontation with her family, and to the lingering memory of Lorenzo's kiss. She hadn't told her mother anything, of course, clinging to the fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the encounter had gone unnoticed. But the summons had shattered that illusion. She dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a simple, elegant black dress that conveyed both respect and a subtle defiance. She wore her hair pulled back in a severe bun, her only adornment a single strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She wanted to project an image of strength and composure, even though she felt anything but. The meeting was held in the Sala del Consiglio, the council room, a large, imposing chamber on the ground floor of the villa. It was a room reserved for the most important family gatherings, a place where decisions were made that could affect the lives of hundreds if not thousands of people. The walls were lined with portraits of past Benedetti leaders, their stern gazes adding to the room's already oppressive atmosphere. When Francesca entered, the room was already filled with the key members of the family. Her uncle, Giovanni, the current head of the Benedetti family, sat at the head of a long, mahogany table, his face a mask of stony disapproval. He was a formidable man, built like a bull, with a voice that could make even the most hardened men tremble. Her mother, Isabella, sat to Giovanni's right, her expression carefully neutral. Other family members, cousins, uncles, and aunts, filled the remaining seats, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. Francesca took her place at the table, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. She felt a knot of tension tighten in her stomach. Giovanni wasted no time in getting to the point. Francesca, he began, his voice cold and hard, we have received disturbing reports from the Marchese Galla. He paused, his eyes fixed on her, his gaze like a physical weight. Reports that you were seen fraternizing with the enemy. Francesca's heart pounded in her chest. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her expression unwavering. I spoke with Signor Santoro, yes. A murmur went around the room. Giovanni's eyes narrowed. Spoke? Is that what you call it? It was a brief conversation, Francesca replied, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Nothing of consequence. Giovanni slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. Nothing of consequence? You were seen kissing him, Francesca. Kissing the heir to the Santoro family. Do you have any idea what that means? Francesca's cheeks flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. It was a mistake, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It won't happen again. A mistake? Giovanni scoffed. This isn't some childish indiscretion, Francesca. This is a matter of family honor, of family security. The Santoros are our enemies. They have been for generations. There can be no liaisons between our families. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. Tell me everything. What did he say to you? What did you discuss? Francesca hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't betray Lorenzo, even though he was her enemy. She couldn't reveal the intimacy of their brief encounter, the unspoken connection she had felt with him. We spoke of the gala, she said, choosing her words carefully. Of mutual acquaintances. Nothing more. Giovanni stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, trying to discern the truth. Francesca held his gaze, her expression impassive. Finally, he sighed, a sound of weary resignation. I don't believe you, Francesca, but I have no proof. For now, I will give you the benefit of the doubt. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping across the assembled family members. Let this be a warning to all of you. The Santoros are not to be trusted. There can be no contact, no communication, no entanglements. The peace between our families is fragile, and one wrong move could plunge us back into war. The meeting continued, focusing on other family matters, but Francesca's mind was elsewhere. She felt the weight of her family's disapproval, the heavy burden of their expectations. She was trapped, caught between her duty to her family and the undeniable pull she felt towards Lorenzo. As the meeting was adjourning, a figure emerged from the shadows near the doorway. Lorenzo. He stood there, unapologetically, his gaze immediately finding Francesca's. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him, then to Francesca. His presence was a blatant challenge, a disregard for the very rules that had just been laid down. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Francesca's. I believe I owe the Signora Benedetti an apology, he said, his voice smooth, yet edged with steel. For my forwardness last night. I assure you, it was not my intention to cause her any distress. The statement was a calculated lie, a performance for the benefit of the assembled Benedettis. But the look in his eyes, the subtle smirk playing on his lips, told Francesca a different story. He was playing a game, a dangerous game, and she was caught in the middle. Giovanni rose from his chair, his face a mask of fury. Get out, he growled, his voice low and threatening. Lorenzo held his ground. I came to apologize, he repeated, his gaze still locked on Francesca. And to return something she left behind. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, delicate silver bracelet, the one she'd been wearing at the gala. It must have slipped off during their encounter. He walked towards her, ignoring the hostile stares of the Benedetti family. He stopped in front of her, his eyes holding hers. Allow me, he murmured, his voice low and intimate. He gently took her hand, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. He fastened the bracelet around her wrist, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary. The air in the room was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing. Francesca felt her heart pounding in her chest, her senses overwhelmed by his presence. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping across the assembled Benedettis. Now, if you'll excuse me, he said, a hint of mockery in his voice. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Francesca to face the wrath of her family and the unsettling realization that this was only the beginning. The silent question lingered in her mind, mirroring his earlier thought. What now? Chapter 4. Whispers in the Benedetti estate. The aftermath of Lorenzo's audacious appearance at the family meeting was a storm of whispered conversations, veiled accusations, and simmering resentment. Francesca found herself increasingly isolated within the walls of the Benedetti estate, the object of both suspicion and pity. Her mother, Isabella, had retreated into a state of icy disapproval, her silence more cutting than any words. Her uncle, Giovanni, had issued a strict order forbidding her from leaving the estate, effectively placing her under house arrest. The other family members treated her with a mixture of caution and condescension, their eyes constantly questioning, their whispers following her like shadows. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, the gilded cage of her family's legacy closing in around her. She spent her days wandering the vast, empty rooms of the villa, her footsteps echoing through the silent hallways. She tried to lose herself in her books, in the familiar comfort of her grandmother's diary, but her mind kept returning to Lorenzo, to the memory of his kiss, to the unsettling challenge in his eyes. She knew she should hate him, should despise him for the chaos he had brought into her life. But she couldn't. There was something about him, a darkness, a vulnerability, that drew her to him, despite the danger, despite the impossibility of their situation. One afternoon, she found herself in the estate's library, a vast, cavernous room filled with towering bookshelves and the scent of old leather and paper. It was a place she had always loved, a sanctuary from the pressures and expectations of her family. She was browsing the shelves, her fingers trailing across the spines of the books, when she heard a soft cough behind her. She turned and saw her cousin Lucia, standing in the doorway. Lucia was a few years younger than Francesca, a quiet, unassuming woman who had always been overshadowed by the more flamboyant members of the family. She had a kind heart and a gentle spirit, and Francesca had always felt a certain kinship with her. "Francesca," Lucia said softly, her voice hesitant, May I speak with you?" Francesca nodded, a flicker of hope stirring within her. Perhaps Lucia, at least, wouldn't judge her, wouldn't condemn her for her actions. Lucia stepped into the library, closing the door behind her. She walked over to Francesca, her eyes filled with concern. I heard about the meeting," Lucia said, her voice barely a whisper. About Signor Santoro." Francesca sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's true," she said, her voice weary. "I kissed him." Lucia's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't seem shocked. I understand," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Francesca looked at her, surprised. "You understand?" Lucia nodded. "I know what it's like," she said, her gaze drifting towards the window, her eyes filled with a distant sadness. "To feel drawn to someone you shouldn't. To feel trapped by family expectations." Francesca's heart went out to her cousin. She had always suspected that Lucia harbored a secret longing, a hidden desire that she couldn't express. "Who is it?" Francesca asked softly, her voice filled with compassion. Lucia hesitated, then shook her head. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's impossible." Francesca reached out and took Lucia's hand, her fingers squeezing hers in a gesture of comfort. "Nothing is impossible," she said, her voice firm. "Not if you truly want it." Lucia looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "But the family doesn't always know what's best," Francesca said, her voice rising slightly. "We have to make our own choices, Lucia. We have to live our own lives." She realized, as she spoke the words, that she was talking as much to herself as to her cousin. She had spent too long living in the shadows, conforming to the expectations of others. It was time to take control of her own destiny, to forge her own path, regardless of the consequences. Lucia squeezed her hand, a grateful smile flickering across her lips. "Thank you, Francesca," she said, her voice filled with emotion. You give me hope." They stood there for a moment, two women bound by a shared understanding, a silent pact of defiance against the constraints of their world. Later that evening, as Francesca was preparing for bed, she heard a soft knock on her door. She opened it and found one of the housemaids, a young woman named Sophia, standing in the hallway, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Signora Francesca," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling, there's someone here to see you." Francesca's heart skipped a beat. She knew, instinctively, who it was. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In the gardens," Sophia replied, her eyes darting nervously towards the hallway. He said to tell you the falcon waits." Francesca's blood ran cold. The falcon waits. It was a coded message, a reference to the Benedetti family crest, a signal that only Lorenzo would know. He was here, on the estate, risking everything to see her. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. She knew she shouldn't see him, should send him away, but she couldn't resist. The pull was too strong, the desire too intense. "Tell him I'll be there," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. She quickly changed into a simple dark dress, her heart pounding in her chest. She slipped out of her room, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. She made her way down the back stairs, avoiding the main areas of the house, her senses on high alert. She crept out a side door. The cool air refreshed her. She had to hurry. She looked around and saw him in the shadows. Her breath hitched. What was going to happen? Chapter 5. The weight of family expectations. The garden was shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the moon, partially obscured by drifting clouds. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth, a heady combination that heightened Francesca's senses. She moved cautiously through the shadows, her eyes scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of Lorenzo. She found him near the old stone fountain, a relic from a bygone era, its sculpted cherubs now weathered and worn. He was leaning against the fountain's edge, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit sky, his posture relaxed, yet alert. He turned as she approached, his dark eyes instantly finding hers, a flicker of something that looked almost like relief crossing his face. "Francesca," he murmured, his voice low and resonant, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. She stopped a few feet away from him, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 questions, 1,000 doubts. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words a mixture of warning and longing. He smiled, a slow, almost predatory smile that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I know," he replied, his voice equally soft, "but I had to see you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his, trying to understand the motives behind his reckless actions.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why risk everything?" He pushed himself off the fountain and took a step closer, his presence overwhelming, the scent of his cologne, that same dark, musky fragrance filling her senses. "Because," he said, his voice barely audible, "I can't stay away." The words hung in the air between them, a confession, a challenge, a promise. Francesca felt her resolve crumbling, the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart dissolving under the intensity of his gaze. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, to cling to the safety of her familiar world. But she couldn't. The pull was too strong, the desire too overwhelming. She had spent years suppressing her emotions, denying her own desires, living a life dictated by duty and obligation. But Lorenzo, with his forbidden kiss, with his reckless disregard for the rules, had awakened something within her, a longing for something more, something real. "They know," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My family, they know about the kiss." He nodded, his expression somber. "I assumed as much. I'm under house arrest," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "I'm not supposed to leave the estate." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure sensation that sent her senses reeling. "I know," he said, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. "And yet here you are." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, savoring the warmth of his hand against her skin. She felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. He wiped it away with his thumb, his touch gentle, tender. "Don't cry, Kara," he whispered, his voice husky with emotion. "We'll find a way." She opened her eyes, looking up at him, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and despair.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Our families, they'll never allow it." He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "We won't let them stop us," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We'll find a way to be together, Francesca. I promise you." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a wave of warmth through her body. It was a different kiss from the one at the gala, less demanding, more tender, a promise of something deeper, something more enduring. She responded, her lips parting beneath his, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a silent expression of their forbidden desire, their unwavering commitment to each other. They stood there for a long moment, lost in each other's embrace, the world outside them fading away, the only reality the feel of his body against hers, the taste of him, the scent of his skin. But the reality of their situation couldn't be ignored forever. The weight of family expectations, the generations-old feud, the ever-present threat of violence, it all loomed over them, a dark cloud threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of their love. As they finally broke apart, a distant sound pierced the silence, the sound of voices, approaching from the direction of the house. Lorenzo's eyes widened, his body tensing. "They're coming," he said, his voice urgent. "You need to go." Francesca nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to get back inside before she was discovered. He grabbed her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "I won't give up." He kissed her one last time, a quick, desperate kiss, then released her hand. She turned and fled, her footsteps silent on the grass, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She slipped back inside the house, her senses on high alert, her mind racing. She had to make it back to her room, undetected. The consequences of being caught, she didn't even want to think about them. But one thought consumed her. Would he really find her?
How?
Chapter 6. Lorenzo's Hidden Scars. Lorenzo watched Francesca disappear into the shadows of the Benedetti estate, his heart a knot of conflicting emotions. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, risking not only his own life, but also the fragile peace between the two families. But he couldn't help himself. He was drawn to Francesca with a force he couldn't explain, a force that defied logic, a force that transcended the generations-old feud that had defined their lives. He made his way back through the gardens, his senses on high alert, his mind racing. He had to be careful, had to avoid detection. The Benedettis were on high alert, and any sign of his presence would be met with swift and brutal retaliation. He reached the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the estate, scaling it with the ease of a man accustomed to navigating the shadows. He slipped into the darkness of the surrounding woods, his footsteps silent on the damp earth. He walked for a long time, his mind replaying the encounter with Francesca, the feel of her lips on his, the warmth of her body against his, the fear and longing in her eyes. He knew he was falling in love with her, a forbidden love, a love that could destroy everything he held dear. He reached his car, a sleek, black Alfa Romeo, hidden amongst the trees. He got in, started the engine, and drove away, his thoughts consumed by Francesca and the seemingly insurmountable obstacles that stood between them. He drove to his own family's estate, a sprawling villa located on the opposite side of Florence, a mirror image of the Benedetti estate, yet worlds apart in terms of atmosphere and allegiance. The Santoro estate was a fortress, a symbol of power and intimidation, a place where secrets were kept and vendettas were planned. As he entered the villa, he was greeted by his father, Donato Santoro, the current head of the family, a man who ruled with an iron fist, a man who had taught Lorenzo everything he knew about the ruthless world of the mafia. Donato was sitting in his study, A large, imposing room filled with dark wood furniture and the scent of expensive cigars. He was a large man, built like a bear, with a face that bore the scars of countless battles, both physical and metaphorical. "Lorenzo," Donato said, his voice gruff, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Where have you been?" Lorenzo hesitated, knowing that he couldn't reveal the truth. "Out," he replied, his voice evasive. Donato raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "Out where?" Lorenzo shrugged. "Just driving." Donato stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching his, trying to discern the truth. Lorenzo held his gaze, his expression impassive. Finally, Donato sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "You're playing with fire, Lorenzo," he said, his voice low and warning. "You know the rules. No contact with the Benedettis." Lorenzo nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, father." "The peace is fragile," Donato continued, his voice rising slightly. "One wrong move, and we'll be back at war. And this time, it could be the end of us." Lorenzo knew his father was right. The feud between the Santoros and the Benedettis had been simmering for decades, a cycle of violence and retribution that had claimed countless lives. The current truce was tenuous, held together by a delicate balance of power and mutual fear. "I understand, father," Lorenzo said, his voice firm. "I won't do anything to jeopardize the family." Donato looked at him, his eyes softening slightly. "I know you have impulses, Lorenzo," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But you need to control them. You're the heir. You have responsibilities." Lorenzo nodded, his heart heavy. He knew his father was right. He couldn't afford to be reckless, to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had a duty to his family, to his legacy. But as he walked away from his father's study, his mind returned to Francesca, to the memory of her smile, to the feel of her in his arms. He knew he couldn't stay away from her, regardless of the consequences. He went to his own room, a spacious suite that reflected his own personality, dark, brooding, and filled with hidden depths. He changed out of his clothes, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to see Francesca again, a way that wouldn't jeopardize the family, a way that wouldn't put her in danger. He walked over to a locked cabinet, hidden behind a tapestry on the wall. He opened it, revealing a collection of weapons, guns, knives, and other tools of his trade. He reached for a small, antique pistol, a relic from a bygone era. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had been a legendary figure in the Santoro family, a man who had known both great love and great loss. As Lorenzo held the pistol in his hand, he thought of his grandfather's stories, of the forbidden love affair he had had with a woman from a rival family, a woman who had ultimately betrayed him, leading to his downfall. He saw a parallel between his own situation and his grandfather's, a chilling echo of the past repeating itself in the present. Was he destined to repeat his grandfather's mistakes? Was his love for Francesca doomed to end in tragedy? He knew he had scars, emotional ones that came directly from his family's past. He placed the pistol down and slid the cabinet door closed with a thud. He wouldn't repeat history. He wouldn't. But how? Chapter 7. A stolen moment under moonlight. The days that followed were a torment of waiting and uncertainty for Francesca. Confined to the Benedetti estate, she felt like a caged bird, her spirit yearning for freedom, for a glimpse of Lorenzo. She replayed their encounter in the garden over and over again in her mind, clinging to the memory of his touch, his kiss, his promise to find her. She tried to occupy her time, to distract herself from the gnawing anxiety that consumed her. She helped in the kitchen, she read, she wandered the gardens, always searching for a sign, a message, anything that would connect her to Lorenzo. She confided in Lucia, sharing her fears and her hopes, finding solace in her cousin's quiet understanding. Lucia, emboldened by Francesca's words, had begun to tentatively explore her own forbidden desires, exchanging secret glances with a young stable hand who worked on the estate, a man far below her social standing, a man who made her heart flutter with a mixture of fear and excitement. One evening, as Francesca was sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sophia, the housemaid, approached her, her eyes wide with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. "Signora Francesca," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling, "a message from the Falcon." Francesca's heart leaped with anticipation. She took the small, folded piece of paper from Sophia's hand, her fingers trembling slightly. She unfolded it and read the brief, handwritten message. "Tonight. Midnight. The old oak tree by the river." It was unsigned, but she knew, instinctively, that it was from Lorenzo. He had found a way, just as he had promised. She spent the rest of the evening in a state of heightened anticipation, her mind racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She knew she was taking a risk, defying her family, jeopardizing her safety. But she couldn't resist. She had to see him, had to know if their forbidden love had any chance of survival. As midnight approached, she slipped out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way through the silent house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She reached the side door that led to the gardens, the same door she had used before, her senses on high alert. She stepped out into the cool night air, the scent of jasmine and damp earth filling her lungs. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, illuminating her path. She moved quickly through the shadows, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of danger. She reached the old oak tree by the river, a majestic, ancient tree that had stood sentinel over the estate for centuries. Its gnarled branches reached towards the sky like twisted arms, its leaves rustling softly in the night breeze. Lorenzo was waiting for her, leaning against the trunk of the tree, his figure silhouetted against the moonlit water. He turned as she approached, his dark eyes instantly finding hers, a smile playing on his lips. "Francesca," he murmured, his voice low and resonant, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. She rushed into his arms, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and joy. He held her close, his embrace tight, protective, his heart beating in time with hers. I thought I wouldn't see you again," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that erased all her doubts, all her fears, leaving only the overwhelming reality of their love. "I told you," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I'll always find you." They stood there for a long moment, lost in each other's embrace, the world outside them fading away, the only reality the feel of his body against hers, the sound of their breathing, the gentle lapping of the river against the bank. They talked for hours, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and desires. Lorenzo told her about his childhood, about the pressures and expectations of growing up in the Santoro family, about the weight of his legacy. He spoke of his desire for a different life, a life free from violence and betrayal, a life where he could be with the woman he loved. He told her about his grandfather and the parallels to his own current situation. Francesca, in turn, told him about her life after Marco's death, about her struggle to find her place in the world, about her longing for something more than the gilded cage of her family's legacy. She told him about her bookstore and her secret writing. They spoke of their forbidden love, of the obstacles that stood in their way, of the seemingly insurmountable challenges they faced. But they also spoke of their determination to be together, their unwavering commitment to each other, their belief that love could conquer all. They made love. Under the moonlight, as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, they knew they had to part. The stolen moment was over, the reality of their situation crashing down on them once more. Lorenzo kissed her one last time, a long, lingering kiss that was both a promise and a farewell. "I'll find a way," he whispered, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "We'll be together, Francesca. I swear it." She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and despair. She watched him disappear into the shadows, her body aching for his touch, her mind racing with 1,000 uncertainties. She turned back to the house. Would he keep his promise? How long would this love have to stay in the dark? Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty and Betrayal. The clandestine meetings between Francesca and Lorenzo continued, each encounter a stolen moment of joy amidst a sea of uncertainty and danger. They met in secret locations, under the cover of darkness, their love growing stronger with each passing day, fueled by the very risk they were taking. But their secret couldn't remain hidden forever. In their world, whispers traveled faster than the wind, and secrets were a currency traded and exploited. The first hint of trouble came in the form of a warning from Lucia, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and concern. "Francesca," she whispered, her voice trembling, I heard them talking. Uncle Giovanni, he suspects something." Francesca's heart sank. She knew this day would come, but she had hoped, against all reason, that they would have more time. "What did you hear?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're watching you," Lucia replied, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "They know you've been leaving the estate. They suspect you're meeting someone." Francesca felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the consequences of being caught, of defying her family, of betraying their trust. The punishment would be severe, not only for her, but also for Lorenzo. She thanked Lucia, her mind racing. She had to warn Lorenzo, had to tell him to be more careful. She sent a message through Sophia, the housemaid, who had become their trusted intermediary, risking her own safety to help them maintain their secret liaison. She waited anxiously for a response, her heart pounding in her chest. The response came the following day, a brief, handwritten note delivered by Sophia, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Understood. The usual place. Tonight." Francesca felt a surge of relief, followed by a wave of trepidation. She knew they were playing a dangerous game, a game that could have devastating consequences. That night, she met Lorenzo at their usual rendezvous point, the old oak tree by the river. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie darkness. She told him about Lucia's warning, about her uncle's suspicions, about the increased surveillance. Lorenzo listened intently, his face grim, his eyes filled with concern. "We need to be more careful," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't risk being caught." They discussed their options, weighing the risks and benefits of each possible course of action. They considered running away, escaping the suffocating constraints of their families, starting a new life together, far away from the violence and betrayal of their world. But they knew it was a fantasy, an impossible dream. Their families would never let them go, would hunt them down, would make them pay for their defiance. They decided to continue their meetings, but with even greater caution, changing their locations, varying their times, using coded messages to communicate. But their precautions weren't enough. One evening, as Francesca was returning from a meeting with Lorenzo, she was intercepted by her uncle, Giovanni, his face a mask of cold fury. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice like thunder, his eyes burning with rage. Francesca hesitated, her mind racing. She couldn't lie, couldn't deny the truth. I was with Lorenzo," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Giovanni's face contorted with anger. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "You defied me," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You betrayed your family." He dragged her back to the villa, his grip tightening with each step. He threw her into the Sala del Consiglio, the council room, the same room where she had been interrogated before. The room was filled with the key members of the family, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Her mother, Isabella, stood in the corner, her expression a mixture of disappointment and shame. Giovanni recounted Francesca's transgressions, his voice filled with venom, his words painting a picture of betrayal and treachery. He spoke of the shame she had brought upon the family, of the danger she had posed to their security, of the potential consequences of her actions. The family members listened in silence, their eyes fixed on Francesca, their gazes filled with judgment. Francesca stood before them, her head held high, her expression defiant. She refused to show weakness, refused to beg for forgiveness. She had made her choice, had followed her heart, and she was prepared to face the consequences. Giovanni announced her punishment. She was to be confined to her room, indefinitely. She was to have no contact with the outside world, no visitors, no communication. She was to be, effectively, a prisoner in her own home. But the worst was yet to come. Giovanni revealed that he had sent men to find Lorenzo, to bring him to justice, to make him pay for his role in Francesca's betrayal. Francesca's blood ran cold.
She knew what that meant.
Lorenzo's life was in danger. Her family would show him no mercy. She pleaded with Giovanni, begged him to spare Lorenzo's life, offering herself as a sacrifice in his place. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Giovanni was unmoved, his heart hardened by years of hatred and vengeance. As she was being led away to her room, she saw Lucia standing in the hallway, her eyes filled with tears. Lucia slipped a small, folded piece of paper into Francesca's hand, her touch fleeting, her expression desperate. Francesca hid the note in her pocket, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew it was a message from Lorenzo, a message that could be her only hope. As she walked away, she wondered, would she ever be able to truly help him? Was this the end? Chapter 9. Francesca's inner turmoil. Confined to her room, Francesca felt the walls closing in around her, the weight of her family's disapproval pressing down on her like a physical burden. She was a prisoner in her own home, cut off from the outside world, her only contact with the other members of the household the silent, disapproving glances of the servants. She spent her days pacing the floor, her mind racing with 1,000 anxieties, 1,000 fears. She worried about Lorenzo, about his safety, about the fate that awaited him at the hands of her family. She replayed their stolen moments together, clinging to the memory of his touch, his kiss, his promise to find a way. She opened the note that Lucia had slipped her, her hands trembling as she unfolded the small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a brief, hastily scrawled message from Lorenzo. "They're coming for me. I'm going into hiding. Don't worry. I'll be in touch. I love you." The words were both a comfort and a torment. She was relieved to know that he was aware of the danger, that he was taking steps to protect himself. But she was also terrified for him, knowing that he was alone, hunted, with nowhere to turn. She spent hours staring out the window, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, her heart aching for a glimpse of him, a sign that he was safe. She imagined him out there, somewhere in the shadows, fighting for his survival, clinging to the hope of being reunited with her. She thought of her grandmother's diary, of the forbidden love affair that had ended in tragedy. Was she destined to repeat history? Was her love for Lorenzo doomed to the same fate? She refused to believe it. She clung to the belief that their love was stronger, that they could overcome the obstacles that stood in their way, that they could find a way to be together. She began to write, pouring her heart and soul onto the pages of a hidden notebook, her words a testament to her love for Lorenzo, her defiance of her family, her determination to forge her own path. She wrote of their stolen moments, of their shared dreams, of their unwavering commitment to each other. She wrote of her own inner turmoil, of the conflict between her duty to her family and her desire for personal freedom. She explored the complexities of her emotions, the guilt, the shame, the fear, but also the love, the passion, the hope that burned within her. She realized that she had spent her life living in the shadows, conforming to the expectations of others, suppressing her own desires. But Lorenzo had awakened something within her, a fierce independence, a rebellious spirit, a longing for something more. She was no longer the passive, obedient woman she had once been. She was a woman in love, a woman willing to fight for what she believed in, a woman determined to break free from the constraints of her family's legacy. One evening, as she was sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of red and gold, she heard a soft knock on her door. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't expecting any visitors. The servants had been instructed to leave her meals outside her door, to avoid any unnecessary contact. She cautiously opened the door, her eyes widening in surprise. It was Lucia, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Francesca, Lucia whispered, her voice trembling. I have news about Lorenzo. Francesca's heart skipped a beat. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of hope and dread coursing through her veins. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is he all right? Lucia nodded, her eyes darting nervously towards the hallway. He's safe, she said, her voice low and urgent.
For now.
But he needs your help. Francesca felt a wave of relief wash over her. He was alive. He was safe. But he needed her. What can I do? She asked, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a fierce determination.
Tell me.
I'll do anything. Lucia explained that Lorenzo was hiding in a remote mountain cabin, a place known only to a few trusted members of his family. He was injured, wounded in a confrontation with Giovanni's men, and he needed medical supplies, food, and a way to escape the country. Lucia had managed to gather some supplies, risking her own safety to help her cousin. But she couldn't get them to Lorenzo on her own. She needed Francesca's help. Francesca didn't hesitate. She knew the risks, knew the consequences of being caught. But she couldn't abandon Lorenzo, couldn't leave him to face his fate alone. I'll do it, she said, her voice unwavering. I'll get the supplies to him. They devised a plan, a daring, dangerous plan that could cost them everything. But they were determined to succeed, driven by their love for Lorenzo, their loyalty to each other, their shared defiance of the families that sought to control their lives. It was dangerous. It was reckless. But she knew, with unwavering clarity, that she had to help him. They had to get to him.
But how?
Chapter 10. A glimmer of hope in the darkness. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless, but Francesca and Lucia were driven by a desperate hope, a fierce determination to save Lorenzo. They knew that failure would mean not only Lorenzo's death, but also their own ruin, perhaps even a renewed outbreak of violence between the families. Lucia had managed to secure a small, battered car, an old Fiat that belonged to one of the estate's groundskeepers. It was inconspicuous, unlikely to attract attention, and Lucia, who had learned to drive in secret, was confident she could navigate the winding mountain roads. Francesca, using her knowledge of the estate's layout and the routines of the guards, devised a plan to sneak out of the villa undetected. She would leave under the cover of darkness during the shift change, when security was at its most lax. They gathered the supplies that Lucia had procured: bandages, antiseptic, pain medication, antibiotics, along with food, water, and warm clothing. They packed everything into a small, nondescript bag, hoping it wouldn't arouse suspicion. The night of their escape was cold and clear, the moon a sliver in the inky sky. Francesca, dressed in dark clothing, her heart pounding in her chest, waited for the signal from Lucia, a prearranged series of knocks on her door. The knocks came, soft but insistent. Francesca took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She slipped out of her room, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. She made her way through the darkened hallways, her senses on high alert, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. She reached the side door that led to the gardens, the same door she had used before. She eased it open, slipping out into the cool night air. Lucia was waiting for her, the Fiat's engine idling softly, its headlights dimmed. Francesca climbed into the passenger seat, her heart racing. Lucia put the car in gear, and they drove slowly, silently, through the darkened grounds, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the shadows. They reached the estate gates, their hearts in their throats. Lucia slowed the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The guard on duty, a young man who had always been friendly to Lucia, approached the car, his flashlight beams sweeping across the interior. Lucia lowered the window, her face pale but composed. "Evening, Marco," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Just going for a late-night drive. Couldn't sleep." The guard hesitated, his eyes scanning the car. Francesca held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice the bag of supplies hidden on the floor. "All right, Signorina Lucia," he said finally, his voice slightly hesitant. "But be careful. It's a dark night." He waved them through, the gate creaking open. Lucia drove slowly, deliberately, until they were out of sight of the estate. Then, she pressed down on the accelerator, the car speeding along the winding country roads, heading towards the mountains. The drive was long and arduous, the roads treacherous, the darkness oppressive. Francesca sat beside Lucia, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her mind racing with 1,000 anxieties. She worried about Lorenzo, about his injuries, about the possibility of being caught. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder, the landscape more desolate. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a dirt track, winding precariously along the edge of steep cliffs. Lucia navigated the treacherous terrain with skill and determination, her focus unwavering. She had learned to drive these roads in secret, practicing late at night, when no one was around, driven by a desire for freedom, for a life beyond the confines of the estate. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached their destination, a small, isolated cabin nestled amongst the trees, its windows dark and silent. Lucia parked the car a short distance from the cabin, hiding it amongst the trees. They gathered the supplies and approached the cabin cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. Lucia knocked on the door, a prearranged series of knocks, the same signal she had used with Francesca. The door creaked open, and Lorenzo stood there, his face pale and drawn, his arm in a makeshift sling. His eyes widened in surprise and relief as he saw Francesca, a flicker of hope lighting up his features. "Francesca," he murmured, his voice weak but filled with emotion. "You came." She rushed into his arms, her body trembling with relief. He held her close, his embrace tight, his heart beating in time with hers. "I told you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'd always find you." They spent the next few hours tending to Lorenzo's wounds, cleaning and bandaging the deep gash on his arm. He had lost a lot of blood, but he was strong, resilient, his spirit unbroken. They talked, sharing their fears and their hopes, their dreams and their plans. They knew they couldn't stay in the cabin for long. It was too dangerous. Giovanni's men would be searching for them, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. They decided to leave at dawn, to make their way to the coast, where Lorenzo had a contact who could help them escape the country. It was a risky plan, but it was their only hope. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, they prepared to leave. Lorenzo, despite his injuries, was determined to be strong, to protect Francesca, to lead them to safety. They gathered their belongings, their hearts heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. They stepped out of the cabin, into the cold mountain air, their future uncertain, their love their only guide. As they began their descent, Francesca couldn't shake the feeling that this could possibly work. But would they make it? Or was this simply false hope? Chapter 11. The Santoro Family's Secrets. The journey to the coast was fraught with peril, each passing mile a testament to their courage and their unwavering determination to be together. Lorenzo, despite his injuries, drove the battered Fiat with a fierce concentration, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, alert for any sign of pursuit. Francesca sat beside him, her hand resting on his good arm, her presence a source of comfort and strength. Lucia, in the back seat, kept watch, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, her senses on high alert. They avoided the main roads, sticking to the back roads, the winding country lanes, the forgotten tracks that snaked through the hills and valleys. They stopped only when necessary, to rest, to refuel, to tend to Lorenzo's wounds. As they drove, Lorenzo began to reveal more about his family, about the secrets and the lies that had shaped his life, the burdens he had carried since childhood. He spoke of his father, Donato, a man hardened by years of violence and betrayal, a man who had taught him to be ruthless, to trust no one, to show no weakness. He spoke of his mother, a woman who had died when he was young, a woman he barely remembered, a woman whose death had been shrouded in mystery. He had always been told that she had died of an illness, a sudden, unexpected ailment that had taken her from him too soon. But as he grew older, He began to question the official story, to suspect that there was more to his mother's death than he had been led to believe. He had overheard whispers, caught snippets of conversations, seen fleeting expressions of guilt and fear on the faces of his family members. He had begun to investigate, discreetly, cautiously, probing the secrets of his family's past, seeking the truth about his mother's death. He had discovered that she had been having an affair, a forbidden love affair with a man from a rival family, a man who had been his father's sworn enemy. He had also discovered that his father had found out about the affair, that he had been consumed by rage and jealousy, that he had taken matters into his own hands. The realization had hit Lorenzo like a physical blow, shattering his illusions about his father, about his family, about the world he had always known. He had been living a lie, a carefully constructed facade that had hidden a dark and brutal truth. He had confronted his father, demanding the truth, demanding an explanation. Donato had denied everything, dismissing his son's accusations as the ramblings of a lovesick fool. But Lorenzo had seen the guilt in his father's eyes, the flicker of fear that betrayed his lies. He had vowed to uncover the truth, to expose his father's crimes, to avenge his mother's death. But he had also realized that he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, needed someone he could trust, someone who understood the complexities of his world. He had found that someone in Francesca, a woman from a rival family, a woman who had defied her own family's expectations, a woman who had shown him the true meaning of love and loyalty. Francesca listened intently, her heart aching for Lorenzo, for the pain he had endured, for the burdens he had carried. She understood his need for truth, his desire for justice, his longing for a different life. She promised to help him, to stand by his side, to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. She knew that they were risking everything, that they were challenging the very foundations of their family's power, that they were courting death with every step. As they neared the coast, the landscape began to change, the rugged mountains giving way to rolling hills, the dense forests replaced by olive groves and vineyards. The air grew warmer, the scent of the sea filling their lungs. They reached the small coastal town where Lorenzo's contact was waiting, a secluded fishing village, a place where secrets were easily kept, where strangers were viewed with suspicion. They found the contact, an old fisherman named Salvatore, a man who had known Lorenzo's grandfather, a man who had a reputation for discretion and loyalty. Salvatore greeted them warmly, his weathered face creasing into a smile, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of concern and understanding. He provided them with a safe house, a small, unassuming cottage overlooking the sea, a place where they could rest, recuperate, and plan their next move. He also provided them with information, with news from the outside world, with updates on the search for them. He told them that Giovanni had put a price on Lorenzo's head, that he had offered a substantial reward for his capture, dead or alive. He also told them that Donato was furious, that he had vowed to find his son and make him pay for his betrayal. The news was grim, but it only strengthened their resolve. They knew they couldn't stay in the cottage for long. It was too dangerous. They had to escape the country, to start a new life, far away from the reach of their families. Salvatore had arranged for a boat, a small fishing vessel that would take them across the Mediterranean, to a safe haven, a place where they could begin again. The boat was scheduled to leave the following night, under the cover of darkness. They spent their last day in Italy preparing for their departure, gathering their belongings, saying goodbye to the life they had known, embracing the uncertainty of their future. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the sea, they stood on the balcony of the cottage, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. They looked at the beautiful scene. How could a place so beautiful be filled with so much ugliness? They had to leave. They had to. But would they be followed? Chapter 12. A dangerous dance of desire. The night air was thick with the scent of salt and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. The small fishing boat, aptly named Stella Maris Star of the Sea, bobbed gently in the harbor, its weathered hull a testament to years of battling the elements. Francesca, Lorenzo, and Lucia stood on the docks, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single lantern, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Salvatore, the old fisherman, clasped Lorenzo's hand, his grip firm, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and respect. "Godspeed, my son," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "May the sea be kind to you." Lorenzo nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He knew he was leaving behind everything he had ever known, his family, his legacy, his homeland. But he was also leaving behind a world of violence and betrayal, a world he no longer wanted any part of. He turned to Francesca, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the dangers they faced, the uncertainties that lay ahead. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones, his gaze lingering on her lips. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. Francesca nodded, her heart overflowing with love for this man, this warrior, this survivor. "As long as I'm with you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He kissed her then, a long, passionate kiss that was both a farewell and a promise, a testament to their unwavering commitment to each other, a defiant act against the forces that sought to tear them apart. Lucia, standing nearby, watched them with a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew she was saying goodbye to her cousin, to the woman who had given her the courage to defy her own family, to pursue her own forbidden love. But she also knew that Francesca and Lorenzo were destined to be together, that their love was a force that could not be denied. They boarded the Stella Maris, the boat creaking and groaning beneath their weight. Salvatore cast off the lines, and the boat slowly pulled away from the dock, heading out into the darkness of the open sea. The journey across the Mediterranean was long and arduous, the sea choppy, the wind relentless. Francesca and Lorenzo huddled together in the small cabin, their bodies pressed close, their hands intertwined, finding comfort and warmth in each other's presence. Lucia, despite her seasickness, kept watch, her eyes scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of pursuit. She knew that their families would not give up easily, that they would be searching for them, that they would stop at nothing to bring them back. As the hours passed, the tension grew, the fear gnawing at their insides. They knew they were not safe yet, that they were still vulnerable, that their escape was far from assured. Lorenzo, despite his injuries, remained vigilant, his senses on high alert. He had a gun, a small pistol he had hidden in his belongings, a weapon he was prepared to use if necessary, to protect Francesca, to defend their freedom. He thought of his father, Donato, of the man he had once admired, the man he had now come to despise. He knew that his father would be consumed by rage, that he would be seeking revenge, that he would never forgive him for his betrayal. He also knew that he may one day need to kill his own father. He thought of his mother, of the woman he had barely known, the woman whose death had been shrouded in mystery, the woman he had vowed to avenge. He hoped that she was watching over him, that she was proud of him for choosing love over loyalty, for breaking free from the cycle of violence that had defined his family for generations. And, of course, he thought of Francesca. He thought of Francesca, of the woman who had changed his life, the woman who had shown him the true meaning of love, the woman who had given him the strength to defy his family, to forge his own path. He looked at her now, her face pale and drawn, her eyes closed in sleep, her body nestled against his. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to keep her safe, to build a new life with her, far away from the dangers of their past. As the Stella Maris sailed further into the night, the lights of the Italian coast fading into the distance, a sense of both liberation and trepidation washed over them. They were leaving behind everything they had ever known, venturing into the unknown, their future uncertain, their love their only compass. They were dancing with desire, a dangerous dance, a dance that could lead to either salvation or destruction. They were taking a leap of faith, trusting in each other, trusting in the power of their love to overcome all obstacles. Suddenly, a light appeared on the horizon, a bright, piercing light that grew steadily larger. It was a ship, a large vessel, approaching them at high speed. Lorenzo's heart sank. He knew, instinctively, that it was his family, that they had been found. He looked over to Lucia and Francesca. He knew they were thinking the same thing. Were they about to be captured? Was their escape short-lived? Chapter 13. Echoes of Violence and Regret. The approaching ship cut through the water with aggressive speed, its powerful engines a stark contrast to the gentle chugging of the Stella Maris. Lorenzo's hand instinctively went to the pistol hidden beneath his jacket, his body tensing, his senses on high alert. He exchanged a look with Francesca, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, her hand reaching for his. Lucia, her face pale but resolute, moved to the stern of the boat, her gaze fixed on the approaching vessel. She had a small knife hidden in her boot, a weapon she had carried since her secret trysts with the stable hand, a symbol of her own quiet rebellion. As the ship drew closer, they could make out the figures on deck, silhouetted against the bright lights. It was a Santoro vessel, no doubt, its sleek, black hull a menacing presence in the darkness. Lorenzo recognized the figure standing at the bow, his father, Donato, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with rage. "Lorenzo!" Donato's voice boomed across the water, amplified by a loudspeaker. "You cannot escape. Surrender now, and I promise you leniency." Lorenzo scoffed, his grip tightening on the pistol. Leniency? From the man who had murdered his mother? From the man who had ordered his own son's death? He would rather die than surrender. He looked at Francesca, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I never wanted to put you in danger." Francesca shook her head, her hand squeezing his. "We're in this together," she said, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. Until the end. The Santoro ship pulled alongside the Stella Maris, its sheer size dwarfing the small fishing boat. Ropes were thrown, grappling hooks securing the two vessels together. Santoro men, armed with automatic weapons, swarmed onto the deck of the Stella Maris, their faces grim, their movements swift and efficient. Lorenzo raised his pistol, his finger on the trigger, prepared to fight, to defend himself and Francesca, to go down fighting rather than surrender. But he knew it was a futile gesture. They were outnumbered, outgunned, their situation hopeless. Donato stepped onto the deck of the Stella Maris, his eyes fixed on Lorenzo, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "You disappoint me, son," he said, his voice cold and hard. "You betray your family, you consort with the enemy, you shame our name." Lorenzo stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "You have no honor, father," he said, his voice ringing with defiance. "You are a murderer, a liar, a tyrant. I want nothing to do with you, or your world." Donato's face contorted with rage. He raised his hand, signaling his men to take Lorenzo. But before they could move, a shot rang out, a single, deafening blast that echoed across the water. Donato staggered backward, his eyes widening in shock, his hand clutching his chest. A crimson stain bloomed on his white shirt, spreading rapidly, staining the fabric with his lifeblood. Everyone froze, stunned into silence, their eyes fixed on Donato, who slowly crumpled to the deck, his body convulsing, his life ebbing away. Lorenzo lowered his pistol, his hand trembling, his mind reeling. He hadn't fired the shot. He had been prepared to, but he hadn't pulled the trigger. He looked around, his eyes searching for the shooter, his heart pounding in his chest. His gaze fell on Lucia, standing at the stern of the boat, her small knife clutched in her hand, her face a mask of shock and horror. But then he realized, it wasn't the knife. Lucia was holding something else, something small and metallic, something that glinted in the moonlight. It was a gun, a tiny Derringer pistol, the kind often carried by women for self-defense. Lucia had fired the shot. Lucia, the quiet, unassuming cousin, the woman who had always lived in the shadows, had killed Donato Santoro, the head of one of the most powerful mafia families in Italy. The Santoro men, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated, their weapons lowered, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Lorenzo seized the opportunity. He grabbed Francesca's hand, pulling her towards the railing of the Stella Maris. "Jump!" he yelled, his voice urgent. "Jump into the water." They leaped over the railing, plunging into the cold, dark depths of the Mediterranean. The shock of the cold water took their breath away, but they surfaced quickly, their eyes fixed on the Stella Maris, where chaos had erupted. The Santoro men, recovering from their initial shock, were now firing their weapons, the bullets whizzing past Lorenzo and Francesca's heads, splashing into the water around them. Lorenzo pulled Francesca towards the shore, swimming with all his might, his injured arm screaming in protest. They had to reach the shore, had to find cover, had to escape the carnage. They swam. They had a new problem. He felt regret, but he was alive. They were alive. But Lucia, would she make it? Chapter 14. Francesca's stand against tradition. The cold water of the Mediterranean was a shock to their systems, but the adrenaline coursing through their veins kept Francesca and Lorenzo swimming, their strokes powerful and desperate. They could hear the shouts and gunfire behind them, a terrifying reminder of the chaos they had left behind on the Stella Maris. They reached the shore, gasping for breath, their bodies shivering, their clothes soaked and heavy. They scrambled onto the rocky beach, seeking shelter amongst the jagged cliffs and windswept dunes. They huddled together, trying to regain their warmth, their minds racing, trying to process the events that had just transpired. Lucia had killed Donato. Lucia, the quiet, unassuming cousin, had taken a life to save theirs. "Lucia," Francesca whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "What will happen to her?" Lorenzo shook his head, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and concern. "I don't know," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "She saved us, Francesca. She saved us both." They knew that Lucia would be facing the wrath of the Santoro family, that her life was in grave danger. They had to find a way to help her, to repay her sacrifice, to ensure her safety. But for now, they had to focus on their own survival. They were fugitives, hunted by both the Santoros and the Benedettis, with nowhere to turn, no one to trust. They started walking, following the coastline, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads, their senses on high alert. They walked for hours, their bodies aching, their feet blistered, their spirits flagging. As dawn approached, they found a small, deserted fishing shack, ramshackle structure perched precariously on the edge of a cliff. They broke in, seeking shelter from the elements, hoping to find some respite, some temporary safety. They collapsed on the floor, exhausted, their bodies shivering, their minds numb. They huddled together, sharing their body heat, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence. As the sun rose, casting a golden glow over the sea, Francesca began to formulate a plan. She realized that they couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding. They had to confront their families, had to expose the truth, had to break the cycle of violence and betrayal that had plagued their lives. She knew it was a dangerous plan, a seemingly impossible task. But she was no longer the passive, obedient woman she had once been. She was a woman in love, a woman who had witnessed too much death and destruction, a woman who was determined to fight for a better future. "We have to go back," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We have to go back to Florence." Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Are you crazy?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "They'll kill us, Francesca. Both of us. They'll kill us if we keep running," Francesca replied, her voice unwavering. "We have to face them, Lorenzo. We have to expose the truth about your father, about your mother, about everything." She explained her plan, a daring, audacious plan that relied on her knowledge of her family, on her understanding of their traditions, on her ability to manipulate their expectations. She would return to the Benedetti estate alone. She would present herself as a repentant daughter, a woman who had realized the error of her ways, a woman who was willing to submit to her family's authority. She would use her position, her status as a Benedetti, to gain access to the family secrets, to gather evidence, to expose the truth about Donato's crimes, to clear Lorenzo's name. Lorenzo was hesitant, reluctant to let her go, to put her in danger. But he also knew that she was right, that they couldn't keep running forever, that they had to confront their past, to break free from the chains of their family's legacies. He agreed to her plan, reluctantly, his heart heavy with apprehension. He would remain in hiding, waiting for her signal, ready to intervene if necessary, to protect her, to fight for their future. They embraced a long, passionate embrace that was both a farewell and a promise, a testament to their unwavering love, their unbreakable bond. Francesca set off alone, leaving Lorenzo behind in the fishing shack, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with 1,000 uncertainties. She walked for hours, following the coastline, heading towards Florence, towards her family, towards her destiny. She knew that she was walking into a trap, that she was risking her life, that she might never see Lorenzo again. But she was determined to fight, to stand up against tradition, to break the cycle of violence, to create a better future for herself, for Lorenzo, and for the generations to come. This plan of hers was risky. Very risky. But it was the only choice. Or was it? Chapter 15. Lorenzo's Confession of the Heart. While Francesca embarked on her perilous journey back to the Benedetti estate, Lorenzo remained hidden in the desolate fishing shack, his mind a tempest of conflicting emotions. He was torn between his admiration for Francesca's courage and his overwhelming fear for her safety. He paced the small, cramped space, his injured arm throbbing, his thoughts consumed by the woman he loved and the dangerous game she was playing. He knew Francesca's plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. She was walking into the lion's den, willingly placing herself at the mercy of her family, a family that had shown no qualms about using violence to enforce its will. He questioned his decision to let her go, to allow her to take such a risk. He should have stopped her, should have insisted on finding another way, a safer way. But he also knew Francesca's strength, her unwavering determination, her fierce independence. She was not a woman to be controlled, to be dictated to be confined by the expectations of others. She had a fire in her soul, a burning desire for justice, a longing for a life free from the shadows of their family's pasts. He sat down on the rough wooden floor, his back against the cold, damp wall, his gaze fixed on the small, dusty window that overlooked the sea. He thought of his life, of the path that had led him to this moment, of the choices he had made, of the regrets he carried. He had grown up in a world of violence and betrayal, a world where loyalty was paramount, where family came first, where any perceived transgression was met with swift and brutal retribution. He had been taught to be ruthless, to be suspicious, to trust no one, to show no weakness. He had followed his father's footsteps, embracing the life of a mafioso, immersing himself in the dark underbelly of Italian society. He had participated in acts of violence, in deals that skirted the edges of the law, in a constant struggle for power and control. But he had always felt a sense of unease, a nagging doubt that gnawed at his conscience. He had seen the toll that violence took, the lives it destroyed, the families it shattered. He had questioned the morality of his actions, the justification for the bloodshed, the endless cycle of revenge. He had longed for something more, something different, a life free from the darkness that surrounded him. He had found that something in Francesca, a woman who embodied everything he was not, a woman who represented a world of light and hope, a world he desperately wanted to be a part of. He had fallen in love with her instantly, captivated by her beauty, her intelligence, her spirit. He had known that their love was forbidden, that it was a dangerous game, that it could cost them everything. But he hadn't been able to resist, had been drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He had confessed his love to her, pouring out his heart, revealing his deepest fears, his innermost desires. He had told her about his mother, about his suspicions about his father, about his longing for a different life. And now, as he sat alone in the fishing shack, waiting for Francesca's signal, he confessed his love again, silently, to the empty room, to the sea, to the sky, to the universe. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I love you. I love you more than life itself. I love you more than my family, more than my legacy, more than anything in this world. He closed his eyes, picturing her face, her smile, her eyes, the way she looked at him, the way she made him feel. He clung to the memory of her touch, her kiss, her embrace, the warmth of her body against his. He prayed for her safety, for her success, for their future together. He prayed that she would be able to expose the truth, to clear his name, to break the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. He knew that he might never see her again, that she might be captured, tortured, killed. But he also knew that she was strong, resilient, resourceful. She was a Benedetti, and she had the courage and the cunning to outwit her enemies. He waited, his heart heavy with apprehension, his mind filled with a mixture of hope and despair. He waited for her signal, for a sign that she was safe, for a chance to reunite with the woman he loved, to build a new life with her, far away from the shadows of their past. He wasn't sure how long he could stay hidden. He hoped that her plan, however risky, would work. But how could it? He had to have faith. Chapter 16. The Gathering Storm of War. Francesca's return to the Benedetti estate was met with a mixture of shock, suspicion, and grudging relief. She had arrived at dawn, presenting herself at the gates, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale and drawn, her demeanor contrite and subdued. She had told the guards that she had been kidnapped, held against her will, that she had managed to escape, that she was grateful to be home. She had begged for forgiveness, for a chance to redeem herself, to prove her loyalty to the family. Her uncle, Giovanni, had received her with a cold, calculating gaze, his eyes filled with suspicion. He had interrogated her for hours, questioning her about her ordeal, probing for any inconsistencies, any hint of deception. Francesca had played her part perfectly, feigning fear, remorse, and gratitude. She had spun a tale of captivity and escape, carefully omitting any mention of Lorenzo, any hint of their continued relationship. She had emphasized her loyalty to the family, her desire to atone for her past mistakes, her willingness to submit to their authority. Giovanni, while still wary, had eventually relented, granting her a probationary return to the family fold. He had warned her, however, that she would be under constant surveillance, that any further transgression would be met with swift and merciless punishment. Francesca was confined to her room, but this time it was a confinement of her own choosing, a strategic maneuver in her daring plan. She used the time to gather information, to probe the secrets of the estate, to seek evidence that would expose Donato's crimes and clear Lorenzo's name. She started with her mother, Isabella, who, while initially distant and disapproving, gradually softened towards her daughter, her maternal instincts overriding her adherence to family tradition. Francesca subtly questioned her mother about the past, about Lorenzo's mother, about the circumstances surrounding her death. Isabella, initially reluctant to speak, eventually revealed fragments of information, whispers and rumors she had heard over the years, hints of a forbidden love affair, of a jealous husband, of a tragic end. Francesca also sought out Lucia, who had been confined to her own room, ostracized by the family for her role in Donato's death. Lucia, initially fearful and withdrawn, eventually confided in Francesca, sharing her own suspicions about the Santoro family, about the dark secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of their opulent world. Meanwhile, the news of Donato's death had sent shockwaves through the Italian underworld. The Santoro family, leaderless and fractured, was in disarray, their power and influence waning. The other mafia families, sensing an opportunity, began to circle, vying for control of the Santoro territory, their resources, their lucrative operations. A storm was gathering, a storm of violence and betrayal, a storm that threatened to engulf the entire region in a bloody mafia war. The fragile peace that had existed between the families was shattered, replaced by an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Francesca knew that time was running out. She had to act quickly, had to expose the truth before the violence escalated, before more lives were lost. She discovered a hidden compartment in her grandmother's old writing desk, a secret drawer containing a collection of letters, documents, and photographs. The evidence she had been searching for, the proof of Donato's crimes, was right there, in front of her. The letters were written by Lorenzo's mother, detailing her passionate love affair with a man from a rival family, a man who was not Donato. The documents reveal Donato's financial dealings, his illegal operations, his connections to corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials. The photographs show Donato with his mistress, a woman who had borne him a child, a secret heir to the Santoro fortune. Francesca had the evidence she needed. Now, she had to find a way to use it, to expose the truth, to bring down the Santoro empire, to clear Lorenzo's name, to end the cycle of violence once and for all. She knew that she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, powerful allies who could help her navigate the treacherous waters of the Italian underworld, who could protect her from the wrath of the Santoro family. She decided to reach out to the Marchesi family, the hosts of the fateful gala where she had first encountered Lorenzo, the family that had long been rivals of both the Benedettis and the Santoros. The Marchesis were known for their neutrality, their adherence to a strict code of honor, their commitment to justice. She sent a message to the Marchesi patriarch, Don Alessandro, requesting a secret meeting, promising to reveal information that would change the balance of power in the Italian underworld forever. The meeting was arranged, a clandestine rendezvous in a neutral location, a centuries-old church in the heart of Florence. Francesca, accompanied by Lucia, who had agreed to stand by her cousin, no matter the cost, prepared to face her destiny, to confront the forces that had shaped her life, to fight for a future free from the shadows of the past. She had no doubt that she was about to start a war. But what choice did she have? Chapter 17. Sacrifices made in the name of love. The ancient church, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, was a sanctuary of silence and shadows, a fitting backdrop for the clandestine meeting that was about to unfold. Francesca and Lucia, cloaked in dark shawls, their faces hidden in the dim light, waited nervously in a secluded pew, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Don Alessandro Marchesi arrived promptly, accompanied by two of his most trusted lieutenants, their faces grim, their demeanor alert. He was an imposing figure, tall and lean, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through to the very soul. Francesca rose to greet him, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "Don Alessandro," she said, her voice echoing through the vast, empty church. "Thank you for meeting with me." Don Alessandro nodded, his eyes studying her intently. "You promised information," he said, his voice deep and resonant. Information that would change the balance of power. Francesca took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She knew that she was taking a tremendous risk, that she was placing her life and Lucia's in the hands of a man she barely knew, a man who could easily betray her to her enemies. But she had no other choice. She had to trust someone, had to find an ally who could help her expose the truth, who could protect her from the wrath of the Santoro family. She revealed her story, telling Don Alessandro about her forbidden love for Lorenzo, about Donato's crimes, about the evidence she had uncovered, about the impending mafia war that threatened to engulf the region in bloodshed. She presented the letters, the documents, the photographs, laying bare the secrets of the Santoro family, exposing the dark underbelly of their opulent world. Don Alessandro listened intently, his face impassive, his eyes betraying nothing. His lieutenants, however, exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. When Francesca had finished, Don Alessandro remained silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the evidence spread out before him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "This is grave news, Signora Benedetti," he said, his voice echoing through the church. "Grave news indeed. The implications are far-reaching." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Why have you come to me?" he asked, his voice probing. "Why not go to the authorities? To the police?" Francesca shook her head. "The authorities are corrupt," she said, her voice bitter. "They are in the pockets of the Santoros, of the other families. They would never believe me, a woman, a Benedetti." She looked at Don Alessandro, her eyes pleading. "You are known for your neutrality, Don Alessandro," she said, her voice filled with emotion. For your honor, for your commitment to justice. You are my only hope. Don Alessandro considered her words, his mind weighing the risks and the benefits, the potential consequences of his decision. He knew that if he chose to help Francesca, he would be embroiling himself in a dangerous conflict, a war between powerful families, a war that could cost him everything. But he also knew that he could not stand idly by, that he could not ignore the truth, that he had a duty to uphold justice, to protect the innocent, to prevent further bloodshed. He made his decision, a decision that would change the course of their lives forever. I will help you, Signora Benedetti, he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. I will help you expose the truth, and I will protect you from the Santoros. Francesca felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. She had found an ally, a powerful ally who could help her achieve her goals, who could help her save Lorenzo, who could help her bring an end to the violence. Don Alessandro outlined his plan, a strategy that involved using his influence, his connections, his resources to expose Donato's crimes, to discredit the Santoro family, to bring them down from within. He would leak the evidence to the press, to trusted journalists who were not afraid to challenge the powerful, who were committed to uncovering the truth. He would also inform certain figures within law enforcement, individuals who were known for their integrity, who were not beholden to the mafia families. He would provide Francesca and Lucia with protection, with a safe haven, with a network of support that would shield them from the Santoros' reach. He would call a meeting. But he also warned them of the dangers, of the risks they were taking, of the sacrifices they would have to make. He told them that the Santoros would not go down without a fight, that they would retaliate, that they would seek revenge. Francesca and Lucia were prepared to face the dangers, to make the sacrifices, to fight for their love, for their freedom, for their future. They were in this together. However, there would be a sacrifice neither of them saw coming. Lucia knew that if the other families learned she killed Donato, they would never accept her back into society. She knew, too, that her forbidden love would never come to fruition. She could never expose her love to the world without risking his death. She made a difficult choice. Francesca, she began, with tears forming in her eyes, when this is all over, I am leaving. I will go far away, where no one will find me. Francesca was shocked. Lucia was giving up everything. For her. Lucia gave her a sad smile. I always knew I would never truly fit in. I need a place to be anonymous. A place where I can find peace. Francesca embraced her cousin. She understood. She finally understood. But the thought of being without Lucia. As they left the church, stepping back into the shadows of the night, they knew that they had set in motion a chain of events that would change their lives forever, that they had ignited a war that would consume everything in its path. But they had also taken their destinies into their own hands, a glimmer of hope and light. They were ready, or so they thought. Chapter 18. A revelation that changes everything. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a carefully orchestrated campaign to expose the Santoro family's crimes and dismantle their empire. Don Alessandro Marchesi, true to his word, used his considerable influence and resources to leak the damning evidence to the press and to select members of law enforcement. The story broke like a thunderclap, shaking the foundations of the Italian underworld. Headlines screamed of murder, corruption, and betrayal, revealing the dark secrets that had long been hidden beneath the veneer of wealth and respectability. The public was outraged, demanding justice, calling for the arrest and prosecution of the Santoro family and their associates. The authorities, spurred into action by the overwhelming evidence and the public outcry, launched a series of raids, arresting key members of the Santoro clan, seizing their assets, and dismantling their operations. Lorenzo, still in hiding, watched the events unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He was relieved to see his father's crimes exposed, his family's power crumbling, but he was also concerned about Francesca, about her safety, about the risks she was taking. He received regular updates from Don Alessandro, who assured him that Francesca was safe, that she was being protected, that she was playing a crucial role in the unfolding drama. Francesca, meanwhile, was living under the protection of the Marchesi family, hidden in a secure location, working closely with Don Alessandro and his lieutenants, providing them with information, guiding their strategy, ensuring that the truth was revealed in its entirety. She had become a key player in the takedown of the Santoro family, a woman who had defied her own family, who had risked everything for love and justice, who had become a symbol of resistance against the corrupt and violent world of the mafia. But the Santoros were not going down without a fight. The remaining members of the family, led by Lorenzo's uncle, Marco Santoro, named after Francesca's deceased husband, a ruthless and ambitious man who had long coveted his brother's power, launched a counteroffensive, seeking to discredit Francesca, to silence her, to reclaim their lost territory. They spread rumors, planted false evidence, and even attempted to assassinate Francesca, sending hired killers to eliminate the woman who had dared to challenge their authority. But Francesca, protected by Don Alessandro's men and guided by her own instincts, managed to evade their attacks, to stay one step ahead of her enemies, to continue her fight for justice. One evening, as Francesca was working late with Don Alessandro, reviewing documents and planning their next move, she stumbled upon a piece of information that changed everything, a revelation that shattered her understanding of the past, that turned her world upside down. She found a hidden file, tucked away in a secret compartment of Don Alessandro's desk, a file that contained a single document, a birth certificate. The birth certificate was for Lorenzo Santoro, but the name of the mother was not the woman Lorenzo had always believed to be his mother. The name on the certificate was Elena Benedetti, Francesca's aunt, her father's younger sister, a woman who had disappeared mysteriously years ago, a woman who had been presumed dead. Francesca's mind reeled, her heart pounding in her chest. Lorenzo was not a Santoro. He was a Benedetti. He was her cousin. The implications were staggering. Their forbidden love was not just a transgression against their families, it was a violation of the most sacred of taboos, a relationship that was considered incestuous, unthinkable, unforgivable. She confronted Don Alessandro, demanding an explanation, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and anger. Don Alessandro, his face pale and drawn, confessed the truth. Elena Benedetti and Donato Santoro had been lovers, their affair a passionate and tumultuous one. Elena had become pregnant, and Donato, fearing the scandal, fearing the wrath of both families, had arranged for Elena to be hidden away, to give birth in secret. The baby, Lorenzo, had been taken from Elena, and she had been told that he had died. Donato had then raised Lorenzo as his own son, fabricating a story about his mother's death, keeping the truth hidden from everyone, including Lorenzo himself. Elena, heartbroken and desperate, had eventually escaped, disappearing without a trace, leaving behind a legacy of secrets and lies. Francesca was devastated, her world shattered, her love for Lorenzo tainted by this shocking revelation. She didn't know what to do, how to process this information, how to reconcile her feelings for Lorenzo with the reality of their blood relationship. She knew she had to tell Lorenzo, had to reveal the truth, no matter how painful it might be. But she also knew that this revelation could destroy him, could break his spirit, could shatter their love forever. She also did not know how to deliver this shocking news. How could she? Chapter 19. The Brink of Destruction and Despair. The revelation of Lorenzo's true parentage hung over Francesca like a shroud, a dark secret that threatened to consume her, to destroy everything she held dear. She wrestled with the agonizing decision of whether or not to tell Lorenzo the truth, knowing that the knowledge could shatter him, could break the bond between them forever. She confided in Don Alessandro, seeking his counsel, his guidance, his wisdom. He listened patiently, his face etched with concern, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and regret. "You must tell him, Francesca," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "He deserves to know the truth, no matter how painful it may be. It is his right." Francesca knew he was right, but the words seemed impossible to speak, the truth too heavy to bear. She imagined Lorenzo's reaction, the shock, the disbelief, the horror, the potential for rejection. She decided to write him a letter, pouring out her heart, revealing the truth in words she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. She wrote of her love for him, of her anguish at this discovery, of her fear of losing him, of her hope that their love could somehow survive this devastating revelation. She gave the letter to Don Alessandro, asking him to deliver it to Lorenzo, to explain the situation, to offer his support, to help him through this difficult time. Don Alessandro agreed, promising to do everything in his power to ease Lorenzo's pain, to help him understand, to guide him through the darkness. Francesca waited, her heart heavy with dread, her mind filled with 1,000 anxieties. She waited for Lorenzo's response, for a sign that he had received the letter, for a glimpse of his reaction, for any indication of his feelings. The days turned into nights, and still, there was no word from Lorenzo. The silence was deafening, the uncertainty unbearable. Francesca began to fear the worst, to imagine that Lorenzo had rejected her, that he had been unable to forgive her, that their love was truly over. Meanwhile, the war between the families continued to rage, the violence escalating, the casualties mounting. The Santoros, weakened but not defeated, were fighting back with a desperate ferocity, seeking revenge against those who had betrayed them, who had brought them to the brink of destruction. Francesca found herself caught in the crossfire, a target for both sides, her life constantly in danger. She relied on Don Alessandro's protection, on the loyalty of his men, on her own instincts and cunning to survive. One evening, as Francesca was working late with Don Alessandro, reviewing documents and planning their next move, they received a message, a coded message from Lorenzo. The message was brief, cryptic, but its meaning was clear. Lorenzo wanted to meet Francesca alone. He had chosen a location, a remote, abandoned monastery high in the mountains, a place where they could be safe, where they could talk, where they could decide their future. Francesca's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. She was relieved that Lorenzo had finally contacted her, that he was still alive, that he wanted to see her. But she was also terrified of what he might say, of what he might do, of the possibility that their love was truly over. She prepared for the meeting, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this meeting would be the most important of her life, that it would determine her fate, that it would decide whether she and Lorenzo could ever be together again. She knew, too, that she had no choice. She loved Lorenzo, in spite of everything. She loved him. She set off alone, leaving Don Alessandro behind, her journey a solitary pilgrimage to a place of reckoning, a place of truth, a place where her destiny would be revealed. She traveled through the mountains. She arrived at the monastery. Lorenzo would be there. She knew this. But what would he say? How would he react? How could she prepare herself for whatever he was about to say? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The abandoned monastery stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, a crumbling edifice of stone and silence, a testament to centuries of faith and forgotten prayers. Francesca arrived at the designated hour, her heart a knot of apprehension and longing, her footsteps echoing through the deserted cloisters. Lorenzo was waiting for her in the ruined chapel, his figure a dark shadow amidst the decaying frescoes and shattered stained glass. He turned as she approached, his face pale and drawn, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain, confusion, and a lingering ember of the love she had feared lost. "Francesca," he said, his voice hoarse, his gaze searching hers. "You came." "I had to," she replied, her voice trembling, her eyes meeting his. "We need to talk." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the unspoken truth hanging heavy between them, a barrier that seemed insurmountable, a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. Lorenzo broke the silence, his voice raw with emotion. "The letter Don Alessandro gave me your letter." Francesca nodded, her heart aching, her gaze fixed on his. I didn't know how else to tell you." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of anguish and disbelief. "My father not my father? Elena my mother? You my cousin?" Francesca reached out to him, her hand hovering in the air, hesitant to touch him, afraid of his reaction. Lorenzo. He stepped back, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. It's a lot to process, Francesca. A lot to take in. He walked towards the shattered remains of the altar, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. All my life a lie. Everything I believed, everything I knew a lie. Francesca followed him, her voice pleading. Lorenzo, please look at me. He turned, his eyes red-rimmed, his face etched with a grief she had never seen before. How can I, Francesca? How can I look at you and not see my cousin? The word hung in the air between them, a stark and brutal reality that threatened to extinguish the flame of their love. Francesca took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. Because I am more than that, Lorenzo, she said, her voice firm, her eyes unwavering. I am the woman who loves you, the woman who has fought for you, the woman who has risked everything for you. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. I know this changes things, Lorenzo. I know it makes everything complicated. But it doesn't change the way I feel about you. It doesn't change the love we share. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking a glimmer of hope, a spark of the connection that had bound them together. Can you honestly say that, Francesca? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. After everything? After knowing what we are? Francesca nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Yes, Lorenzo, she said, her voice choked with emotion. I can. Because my love for you transcends blood, transcends family, transcends everything. He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I don't know if I can, Francesca, he said, his voice raw with pain. I don't know if I can overcome this. We can, Francesca insisted, her voice filled with a fierce determination. We can overcome anything, Lorenzo. Together. They stood there, locked in an embrace, their bodies trembling, their hearts aching, their future uncertain. The weight of their family's legacies, the burden of their shared blood, the threat of the outside world, all seemed to fade away, replaced by the raw, undeniable force of their love. But the outside world was still there, waiting, threatening. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the monastery, shattering the fragile intimacy of their moment. Lorenzo stiffened, his senses on high alert. Someone's coming, he said, his voice urgent. He pulled Francesca behind him, shielding her with his body, his hand reaching for the pistol he had hidden beneath his jacket. The figures emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. It was Marco Santoro, Lorenzo's uncle, accompanied by a group of his loyal men. So, Marco said, his voice dripping with venom. The star-crossed lovers, reunited at last. How touching. Lorenzo stood his ground, his gaze fixed on his uncle, his body tensed, ready to fight. Get out of here, Marco, he said, his voice cold and hard. This doesn't concern you. Marco laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the chapel. It concerns me very much, nephew, he said, his voice rising. You have disgraced our family, betrayed our trust, and consorted with the enemy. You deserve to die. Marco raised his gun, aiming it at Lorenzo, his finger on the trigger. Francesca screamed, lunging forward to protect Lorenzo, to shield him with her body. But before Marco could fire, another shot rang out, a single, deafening blast that echoed through the monastery. Marco staggered backward, his eyes widening in shock, his hand clutching his chest. He crumpled to the floor, dead. Lorenzo and Francesca looked around, stunned, their eyes searching for the shooter. Standing in the doorway of the chapel, silhouetted against the fading light, was Lucia, her face pale and drawn, her hand holding a smoking gun. She had saved them again. Lucia lowered the gun, her body trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and regret. It's over, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's finally over. But, of course, it wasn't. They knew it wasn't. Would things ever be over? Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love, albeit a love forever tinged with the bittersweet knowledge of their shared blood. Lorenzo and Francesca, with Lucia's unwavering support and Don Alessandro's continued guidance, navigated the treacherous aftermath of the Mafia War, working tirelessly to dismantle the remnants of the Santoro and Benedetti empires, to expose the corruption, and to bring those responsible to justice. The truth about Lorenzo's parentage, while initially devastating, became a catalyst for healing and reconciliation. Lorenzo, after a period of intense introspection and struggle, came to accept his Benedetti heritage, embracing the connection to Francesca not as a barrier, but as a complex, unconventional bond that deepened their love in ways they had never imagined. They could never marry, not in the eyes of the church or the law, but they built a life together, a life founded on mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and a love that defied definition. They moved far away from Italy, to a remote island where the sun always shone, finding solace and anonymity in a place untouched by the shadows of their past. They adopted 2 children, a boy and a girl, creating a family that transcended the constraints of tradition and bloodlines. Lucia, haunted by her actions but ultimately absolved by the authorities, who recognized her act as self-defense and a desperate attempt to protect her cousins, chose a different path. She remained in Italy, dedicating her life to helping those affected by mafia violence, working tirelessly to support victims, to advocate for justice, and to build a safer, more equitable society. She never married, her heart forever scarred by the forbidden love she had sacrificed, but she found a quiet fulfillment in her work, in her commitment to making amends for the sins of her family. The old mafia families, weakened and fractured by the war and the subsequent revelations, gradually lost their grip on power. A new generation emerged, one that sought to distance itself from the violence and corruption of the past, one that embraced legitimate businesses, legal enterprises, and a more transparent way of life. The cycle of vengeance and betrayal, while not entirely broken, was significantly weakened, replaced by a fragile hope for a more peaceful future. Francesca and Lorenzo often visited the old monastery, the place where their love had been tested, where their lives had been forever changed. They would stand in the ruined chapel, hand in hand, remembering the darkness they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, the love that had sustained them. They would look at each other, their eyes filled with a love that had endured, a love that had defied the odds, a love that had blossomed in the shadow of tragedy. They would remember Lucia's bravery, Don Alessandro's unwavering support, and the countless others who had helped them along the way. And they would know, deep in their hearts, that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, love, in all its complex and unconventional forms, could still prevail. The story was over. Their lives, however, were not. The end.